Hello and welcome back to the competitive biography of Emanuel Lasker. Amos Byrne's 5-game winning streak has propelled him into first place, and for the first time in the entire Amsterdam 1889 tournament, our titular subject finds himself outside of the pole position. However, his fate is entirely in his hands, as in these last two rounds he faces off against his two closest rivals. His first hurdle on the way to winning this tournament is the man who is quite possibly the most fearsome opponent among the British cohort here, James Mason. Now, unlike most European masters, James here actually got his start in America. He played quite frequently in the mid-1870s and ultimately won the Fourth American Chess Congress in 1876. Following this, he moved to Britain, where he played in pretty much every important international tournament between now and then, though his results are a little bit sporadic, so I'll only talk about the important ones here. At Berlin 1881, the Second German Chess Federation Congress, he came in 5th overall, though he was the only person to defeat Blackburn, who went on an incredible 14 out of 16 tear at this event. 2 years later at Nuremberg, he came 3rd overall, and then 2 years after that, he was in the 5-person group who finished 2nd, half a point behind Isidor Gunsberg. Not too shabby. His most important result from the first half of this decade, more than likely, is his 3rd place at the Vienna 1882 tournament, a rather legendary tournament known for more than anything than putting Steinitz back at the top of the chess world after an almost 10-year hiatus. Finally, as for his British Chess Association tournament results, in 1886 he came in 5th overall, while in 1888 he shared 3rd. So certainly not the most consistent results ever, but there's this general belief that James Mason is the kind of player who beats the strong players but loses to the weak ones. He's much more of a socialite than a serious chess player. He would spend more of his nights and evenings drinking and talking and partying rather than studying and resting like some of the more serious professionals would. It's been said that if he played chess as well as Steinitz between the last move of the first game and the first move of the next game, he would be the strongest player on the planet. Anyway, I don't think I need to explain just how important this game is for both players. James needs to win this if he wants any chance of finishing, probably not in first place, but certainly second would be guaranteed, while Lasker needs to win this game if he wants any chance of catching up to Byrne for first. So both players have everything to play for, and I assure you, they play for everything here. Without further delay, let's get to the game. Lasker, with the opening move, starts with e4. James responds e5, we have knight to f3, knight to f6, knight to c3, and knight to c6. So we have 4 knights. Rather than going for any mainline theory discussions with, for example, bishop to b5, Lasker ensures that we stay in rather unique territory and plays the move bishop to e2. We will not be discussing any theory in this game. Bishop to b4 is played in response. We have castles, d6, d3, h6, bishop to d2, and bishop to e6. Now, if you ask the engine, the best move here is to simply play a3. This was played in one game between Anatol Shepernov and Eric Anderson at the 1930 Nordic Championship. What followed was bishop to a5 and now knight to a4. Black took this chance to trade here on d2 and then thrust forward with g5, and Black would actually go on to win this game. Lasker, perhaps unsurprisingly at this point, instead opted for the move queen to c1. This move is a novelty, and so it's as of move 8 that the players are playing a unique game. After knight to e7, Lasker played a move that should be fairly typical by now, knight to d1. We've seen this maneuver a few times now. James traded here on d2, bishop d2, knight d2, and just as in the previous example we showed, g5 was played. Now Lasker's play, as you can see, is fairly timid to start out with, but Mason's is anything but. That man really wants to win this game, and we'll see just how ferocious he is. f3 was played by Lasker here. James continued with knight to g6, and now Lasker went for rook to f2, so that when this knight comes down to f4, his bishop can go to f1. But now h5 comes, and this is just absolutely terrifying for white. Your king is getting attacked straight off. I don't think we've ever seen anybody be this aggressive to Lasker in the entire tournament, but specifically not this early. g3 was played by Lasker here, kicking the knight, and now there's a really crucial move you have to find here as black, and that is, as usual, a very difficult knight retreat. You have to go back to g6. The point being that whatever white plays, let's say he activates his knight to e3, h4 comes. You definitely do not want to be opening files here on the king's side, so g4 comes, and now the knight is able to safely return to f4. White will never feel comfortable on the king's side, and this attack could become very dangerous very quickly. James instead played the move knight to h3 check, which initiates a trade that gives Lasker a little bit of breathing room. Bishop captures h3, bishop captures h3, and now Lasker goes for rook to e2, vacating the f2 square so that he's able to play knight to f2. Now this coerces James to put his bishop all the way back here on e6. I think a reasonable alternative is g4 as well, intending for after knight to f2 to play h4. Knight captures h3, h captures g3, h captures g3, and rook captures h3. This will leave white in a fairly uncomfortable position, though I'm not super sure how good of an attack black will get following knight to f1, defending the g-pawn, and after g captures f3, simply rook to h2. White can play in succession queen to g5, knight to e3, and I can't see this f-pawn lasting for very long, so eventually material will be maintained. I would imagine that black is going to be a little bit better in the resulting position, though probably not by all that much. But okay, the bishop slides back to e6, and Lasker puts his knight here on f1. Now we have a move that really I cannot understand. James Mason in this position played queen to e7. This simply gives up the g-pawn. Now, the one bit of grace I will give them is that this is move 18 that Lasker is about to play, and the time control was 18 moves per hour. So it's a very reasonable idea that the time was quite low, and Lasker did not want to calculate the ramifications of taking this pawn. We will here. The problem that black faces is that if white gets one more move, then queen to h4 simply stops any hope of a kingside attack. So black has to play h4 here. And after g4, rook to g8 can be played, hitting the queen, but the queen will simply slide back to e3. And at some point, white is simply going to play h3. The king side will be relatively secure, and white is more or less up a pawn for nothing. However, Lasker, because of time trouble or otherwise, did not take the pawn, and he instead played knight to f2. Okay, James did not leave the pawn standing for more than one move. He played knight to d7, so now it's all protected. Queen to e3 here by Lasker, preventing black from castling, lest you give up the a-pawn. It's defended through a6, and now c3 was played. Now here James castled, which is certainly a reasonable move to be playing if you're going for a kingside pawn storm, but it does enable Lasker to go on some sort of counterattack. So what happens beyond here? Anyone's guess. Lasker begins his counterattack with b4. This rook is slid over to g8, and now a4 even. g4 gets pushed, and after f captures on g4, again, there is only one move that black can play that gives him some sort of attack, and that's h4. Black's sole priority has to be opening up files. h3 is the best move for white here, and now you can start remaneuvering your knight via f8 to g6 and so on. This is how you should play the attack as black. James, however, went for the recapture bishop captures on g4, and this gives Lasker a whole bunch of initiative. Knight captures g4, rook captures g4, and now queen to f3. Very crucial. It prevents this pawn from going to h4, as of course the rook hangs, and it frees up the e3 square. So after rook h to g8 defends its partner and allows for the h-pawn to be pushed once more, knight to e3 comes. This kicks the rook back, it sits on g5, and now knight to f5. Very beautiful move. This keeps the h4 square firmly under control and also wins a tempo on the queen, so Lasker can get his attack going. Queen to e6 was played, and now a5, really applying the pressure on the queen side. James, seeing that the complications are starting to favor Lasker, decides to try mixing things up in the center with d5. Lasker simply plays rook to b1, and now we reach a very crucial moment of the game where James has to decide not necessarily how to attack, but how to defend. A very consistent move in this position would be to trade here on e4. D captures e4, D captures e4, and now knight to f6. This feels very consistent, but the amount of calculation that you have to do every move, starting with the move b5, A captures b5, and rook captures b5, this sort of position must be absolutely exhausting. For one example, I found one line that leads to a knight's resolution starting with c6. The rook gets kicked back, let's say to b1, and now we trade here. Knight captures e4, queen captures e4, and queen captures on f5. Of course, white isn't going to trade queens here. They're instead going to play queen to b4, going after the b-pawn. And although black can defend it with queen to d7, rook e to b2, and white is going to win back their pawn. So the real question you have to ask here is, who is going to be better in the endgame following, let's say, e4, and trading here on b7? The engine here prefers white, but we're in the 19th century. These rook endgames are going to be absolutely anyone's for the taking. James instead opted for the move c6, keeping this pawn under control and keeping an eye on the b5 square. But Lasker continues going forward with c4. D captures c4, D captures c4. And now that b5 is back on the cards, James decides to go all out on the sacrifices with h4. Can you take this pawn? The tournament book says yes, providing the line knight captures h4, queen captures c4, knight to f5, queen back to e6, and now simply rook to d2. They end here simply saying that white is better. This is a correct assumption, though Lasker's move that he plays certainly doesn't lose or anything. He opts for the more direct move b5. He's going on his own attack. Now this does give James exactly one resource, which he takes. After h captures on g3 and h4, now he gets to play the only move in this position that doesn't absolutely lose right on the spot, the exchange sacrifice rook captures on f5. Now it has to be stated, this is a very good move, though most commentators at the time claimed that this move single-handedly saves the game, which isn't true. Now the question that Lasker has to answer here is, how do you want to retake this rook? And it's a very important question to ask here. Queen captures on f5 is very interesting. Black, of course, wouldn't want to be trading queens right away because that's an endgame that's probably not going to go well. Queen captures c4 in this line doesn't do much because rook to d2 just automatically comes with a double attack on this knight. This is pretty much game over. Rook to g4 is another option, but now white is able to trade queens here on e6 and then push h5. And black is going to be losing a whole bunch of time trying to chase after this pawn. Rook to h8 is another option, but again, we're going to trade here on e6, and now, for example, rook to b3 from white. And it's going to be a very similar endgame as in the previous variation. I can imagine that both of the previous lines will end up in this sort of structured endgame, where black is just completely cooked. These doubled pawns are doing them absolutely no favors, they're still down in exchange, and the endgame is absolutely winning for white. Now the problem that Lasker faces in this position is that James Mason is one of the most renowned endgame players in the world at this time. So any chance of him entering an endgame is a chance for James Mason to escape without giving up the game. So he decides for the moment to keep the queens on the board with e captures on f5 instead. Okay, now queen captures on c4 is more than allowed, and Lasker here trades on c6. B captures c6, b captures c6. Now we are once again at the time control move. Lasker is about to make his 36th move. He's probably very low on time, and he has to come up with a plan here. So I guess this is as good a time as any to ask you to pause the video and see if you can come up with some sort of attacking plan here for white. I'm not going to be, taking away points if you don't get exactly what I get. This is a very complex position, and I'm pretty sure that there are more than one right answer, but let's see what you get. All right, 3, 2, 1, let's talk about it. It is quite difficult to actually continue any sort of attack against the black king here. This knight does a very good job of defending these crucial squares on the b-file, and the active queen permits very annoying tactics. You can imagine something like queen to c5 and queen to c2 check if this rook ever moves off the second rank, which would simply win this rook here. So white has to be very careful. The move that I personally decided on in this position is rook to d2. You're always going to be looking for play against this knight here. And now, for example, rook to g4, very common move. If we can win this h-pawn, that'd be great. And now white gets access to this move, queen to e3. Now this is a move that they wanted to play for a little bit because queen to a7 is a very nice move. However, if queen to d4 would be allowed to be played here, then this is actually an endgame that black can probably draw. So here, if black wants to get the queens off the board, queen to f4 has to be played. But now, queen to d3, and suddenly there's a checkmating threat on the knight. So now, white is ready to trade the queens. Queen to d4 with check, and now importantly we don't take, which ends up in the same drawn endgame as before, but king to g2. Very important difference. After queen captures d3 and rook captures on d3, if black opts to take this pawn right away, then we get rook b to d1, going after the knight. And now there are problems where if the knight goes to some of these squares, then the c pawn will fall to a skewer or a fork or something. So knight to b8 has to be played, but now rook to d8 with check, and after the king moves, rook to f8. The f7 pawn is about to fall, white is about to gain a passed f pawn, and black is in a whole lot of trouble. One more try for black in this particular position. Instead of taking this pawn here, he can instead play e4. This pretty much coerces white into taking on g3, but after rook captures on h4, now we get rook to g7. Knight to e5 defends the pawn, but now king to g3. This kicks the rook all the way back to h8, and after king to f4, black is forced to play the move rook to e8 to defend his knight. But here white is going to enjoy the much more pleasant endgame after, for example, rook to d1. He has an active piece while black does not, and slowly but surely, I can't imagine that all of these weak pawns are going to last on the board for that much longer. White is very slowly going to win this endgame. Now again, this is a very crucial moment right at the time control for Lasker to make, and with everything on the line in this tournament game, he decided to do a very understandable decision and bailed out with queen to e4. I get it, it's a very complex position. This is one of those times where even though the machine will call this a mistake, I'm going to say that this is a perfectly reasonable move. It saves his tournament more or less. After rook to g4, Lasker traded on c4, queen captures c4, rook captures c4, and after rook to g2, James simply took here on h4. And for the first time in the entire Lasker saga, the players split the point with a draw. Despite this material being the same as in the previous line, here white hasn't had the chance to activate his king at all, and that's a very important difference. For example, after rook captures g3, e4, rook to g7, knight to e5, all of this is the same as the previous line. Here, king to g3 would have been very annoying, immediately kicking the rook back, but here the king can only go to g2, and so now black has time to play moves like e3, rook to e1, and now rook to e4, and suddenly white is not the only one with active pieces. This rook is very nicely supporting the pawn. The king, importantly, is able to get into the game, and overall black is more than capable of drawing this game. So with this draw, James Mason's chances of winning this tournament are now 0, but he is very nicely placed to finish in either second or third, while Lasker, of course, still has the very daunting task ahead of him of facing off against the header of the tournament, Amos Byrne. That will be the final game of the tournament, and it will be the subject of our next video, so you have a lot to look forward to, and I look forward to seeing you there. Until then.